Hey there everyone, this is Matthew Hunt here. I am representing Two Cards College and Tournament Poker Edge, and I'm going to do a little short video for you about understanding GTO solutions. So I'll talk a little bit in a moment about what I mean by GTO. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the idea out there, but what I want to do is just briefly explain what it is, what it means, and how we can kind of apply it to game situations, and then take you through a little bit of a GTO solution that I've already calculated on a program called Simple Post Flop. So I'm gonna run that calculation, and we're gonna take a look at the answers that the program gives us, and it'll give us a bit of an insight into what GTO solutions look like in certain spots and how they can be useful for the kinds of analysis that we like to do on a regular basis. So I'm just going to move on now and explain GTO poker in general. What it is it's also known as playing unexploitably, playing at Nash equilibrium, or playing perfect poker. You might hear it referred to as any of those three things. People are very prone to use different terminologies. They don't always use GTO, but generally speaking, when they talk about any of those three things, they are referring to GTO poker. Now, GTO is not the same as playing balanced. Balance is a different thing, and it's also not the same as playing break-even, because break-even poker is very, very different from GTO poker. And the assumption that GTO poker is a way of guaranteeing that we at least break even in a certain game or a certain situation is very wrong, and it's something that has led a lot of people to think that GTO poker or understanding of GTO concepts is useless, but nothing could be further from the truth. So let me explain that for you. To play GTO or unexploitably is to play poker in a way that prevents your opponent from adapting their game in any way that increases their EV. So essentially it means that your opponent is guaranteed to win a certain amount, and there is nothing that they can do to increase that amount. So it essentially means that your opponent's decisions are pretty much meaningless. It doesn't really matter what your opponent does. As long as you understand roughly your own range and your relationship with their range, the actual decisions that they take with different parts of that range don't make a huge amount of difference. Because if you're playing GTO and unexploitably, your EV will be maximized if your opponent plays their own GTO game. But if your opponent plays any differently, then you start to profit even further. So this does not imply break-even play, as you can see, since both players in any given hand, in any heads-up hand at least, will start the hand with a certain amount of EV. So let's say there's 7.5 big blinds in the pot pre-flop, which we'll see in a second is a part of our solution that we're going to look at. Let's say someone 3x raises pre-flop, someone calls, and you have the blinds as well. So you've got 6 big blinds plus 1.5. You've got 7.5 big blinds in the pot pre-flop. The player who calls there, even if they call with an incredibly wide range, they will still at least have some EV, because they at least stand to gain part of that pot there if the play ends right away, because any two cards does have equity against a standard opening range. The problem will come if they play those hands in a way post-flop that loses them so much money that they no longer are able to even capture that EV, so if they make mistakes. But if they play GTO, they will hopefully at least be able to capture some EV in a lot of situations. So we would hope that they'd be able to at least get something out of it. So as soon as we see here, as soon as our opponent deviates from their own GTO strategy, we profit. So basically, if we're playing unexploitably and our opponent is playing exploitably, then even if we lose in certain circumstances, then we profit in others to counteract it, and our overall EV goes up. So for example, if our opponent doesn't fold enough, then we continue playing GTO, we lose some money with our bluffs, and we gain more with our value bets. Once we know our opponent's strategy, so if we know our opponent pretty well, then we can start adapting our own to actually exploit their weaknesses. So we can go a little bit beyond GTO play and look at exploitative play, which is the next step. We can either minimally exploit them. So minimal exploitation more refers to the type of calculation than anything else. What it refers to is running a calculation that only changes one variable. So we determine exactly how our opponent is going to play in a very specific spot, and then we leave everything else in the calculation pretty much unlocked so that our opponent can do whatever else they want outside of that, and we test to see what our response to that specific tendency should be. It's a much more effective way than plugging in our opponent's entire strategy, because ultimately we don't know our opponent's entire strategy unless we have an extremely good read on how we think they're playing. So without that much information, GTO play and minimally exploitative play are a lot more useful than maximally exploitative play. So without further ado, what I'm going to move on to is using simple post-flop, this calculator that I think is going to prove so useful for us. It's a GTO program that can run in-depth calculations, both flop, turn, and river calculations, and we can calculate fairly precise GTO solutions to specific scenarios that we plug in, based on the pre-flop scenario and the ranges that we input. It also means that we can do minimally and maximally exploitative calculations once we plug in different parts of our opponent's strategy. If we add a specific range for a specific part of the hand, and we start to say, well, our opponent is betting with these specific hands on the flop, raising with these, calling with these, then we plug all of that information in, and it basically tells us what we should be doing in order to maximize our EV based on that strategy. So it's an extremely useful and very powerful calculator that can be vital in developing good strategies. So let's take a look at the hand that we're going to analyze here. It's going to be a spot that takes place on the first hand of a tournament that takes place on PokerStars. We call a 3x pre-flop raise, and it's off to the flop. So as I mentioned, it's going to be a 7.5 big blind pot to start the hand. We're going to be 147 big blinds deep behind because it's the very first hand. So we start out with 3,000 chips, 150 big blinds, and we're going to take a flop. So in a moment, I'm just going to bring up simple post flop. So here is our solution that we have here, which is the hand that we've just been looking at. We've looked at a spot with 147 big blinds deep behind, 7.5 big blinds in the pot already. Player 1 is the pre-flop raiser, and player 2 is the pre-flop caller. Player 1 actually has a pretty wide range here, 23% of hands. So this is the starting range here, these blue hands. Ace-2 suited plus, a bunch of King-9 suited, Queen-10 suited, things like that, all broadways, some suited connectors, and all pairs. And player 2 has about 12.5%. So they have a pretty standard flatting range, everything from deuces up to 10s, Ace-10 suited through Ace-Queen, Ace-Jack, Ace-Queen off, King-Queen off, suited broadways, and some low suited aces. So they have a pretty diverse range here, a lot of good board coverage. And you can see that the flop has come King-9-3 with the King of Hearts and 9-3 of Diamonds. So it's a pretty blank-ish kind of a flop. It's a couple of cards that could hit people's ranges here, but generally not too many draws out there. You can see that the boards are, or the EVs rather, are fairly close together here. So player 1's Nash EV is 4.043 big blinds, and player 2's is 3.457. Now, the deeper stacks get, the more decisions are to be made in the hand, so the more the EVs are going to come closer together, and obviously that's as a result of the more and more space for counter interaction and counter exploitation. So you can actually see here, if we click on the first range, we've got player 1's checking range is the first range we can look at, and that's actually a pretty diverse range. You can see that they're checking almost every hand with at least some frequency. In fact, they are checking every hand with some frequency. Even pocket 8. Pocket 8s is checked most of the time here, but not 100%. Some combos of it are checked 100%, some combos aren't. Some middle pairs are also checked sometimes, but generally everything is either checked with a certain frequency or bet with a certain frequency. Only 8s and 7s here are checked with almost 100% frequency. So this definitely kind of goes to show the value of mixing it up here for player 1. You can also see that player two is going to bet pretty frequently. He's going to bet half pot. Half pot is the sizing we've chosen here, with 40% of their range. So obviously a lot of their weakest hands, their bluffs like 8-7 suited, things like that, they're going to bet with pocket 3s, obviously their strongest hand on this board, as well as 9s. They're going to bet sometimes and check sometimes with 9s. Obviously, they're going to bet a lot of flush draws. They're going to bet a lot of King X hands, and their betting range is going to be pretty diverse. So you can see both players here have pretty mixed ranges as far as frequencies go. They're not always betting with certain hands, not always checking with certain others. And of course, on the flop, the other option here is for player 1 to actually bet with 39.5% of hands. So the range is displayed the same way. And then we can follow the tree down. So we can actually follow it. Probably the most interesting place to follow it would be what happens when everybody just keeps raising. What happens when all the chips go in. So here we've got a very rare scenario where player 1 bets half pot. Player 2 raises from 3.75 big blinds up to 9.75. And then player 1 actually re-raises up to 20 big blinds. And then player 2 just shoves. So I don't believe you can actually go more than 4 bets deep here. I think that's as far as it goes on the flop. But of course, this is a very rare scenario where it goes bet, raise, re-raise, shove. But let's look at what happens here, because the interesting fact about this is that even though player 2 has some hands here like pocket threes that could be very strong, you know, king, queen suited, something like that, could be very strong here. Player 2 doesn't have any hands in their range here that would get it all in. So player 2 has nothing in their range that would shove all in for 147 big blinds after player 1 re-raises for the third time. So player 2 is actually just calling that re-raise very, very frequently. And based on the bet sizings, they're getting good odds. They're calling quite a lot. So you can actually see here from this solution how, if both players were playing perfectly, this structure, this betting structure and raising structure, is the way that this hand would play out if both players were maximizing their EV. And player 2 is obviously raising quite frequently here. They're raising 15 or 16% of the time versus the original flop c-bet. They're raising most of their 3s and 9s, most of their strongest hands, some of their king-queens, some flush draws and gut shots, even some weaker hands, some 8-7 suiteds, you know, those flush draws and backdoor flush draws as well. So they're raising a really diverse group of hands here, and everything is done with some kind of variable frequency. In fact, pocket tens is the only hand that is close to complete frequency here, or 100% frequency with certain things, because it is called with almost 100% frequency. It's 3 of the combos are 100% call. The other 3 are 84, 86, 86. So basically the combos of pocket tens that include a diamond or a heart here are a little bit less. Well, actually, the tens with a diamond are occasionally going to be raised, and everything else is just going to be called. But generally, you can see how the frequencies change here. The red, yellow, green. There's a lot of variability there. You can actually also add the option for multiple bet sizes on streets like this, and the program will calculate that for you as well. So it's possible to plug in pretty much as much info as you want in this circumstance. And generally speaking, it's going to be fairly straightforward once you want to do an exploitative calculation to work out what comes next. So let's say, for example, that we decide that player 1 would be c-betting absolutely everything here. Let's say they're just going to kind of go a bit nuts and just c-bet every single hand in their range. In fact, I could probably just do this. There we go. I think we have everything with 100% frequency there. Okay, good. Now what I can do is actually calculate a minimally exploitative version of the situation here based on this tendency. So it's going to calculate now. It's probably going to take a while because these calculations do take a moment and they're pretty complex. So we're going to just leave it to calculate, and I'm going to come back to you when it's done. Okay, so here we are again, guys. It turns out the calculation I was doing, I actually made a bit of a mistake. It doesn't really matter, but I did a calculation for if player 1 was checking 100% of his hands instead of betting 100% of them. So what we've actually got is a completely different scenario, but it's still, it's possible. But it's also interesting to look at a theoretical sort of a situation as well, because we've got a spot here where player 1 checks 100% of hands, and player 2 is going to be checking back a lot, but you can see the EVs already have gone closer together. Player 1's EV has gone down below 4 here, so you can see how the fact that they are playing something other than GTO is costing them here. But if we were to change it even further so that they were now playing a strategy that was somewhat closer to what we might consider an even more exploitable strategy, where they weren't check calling enough hands, we could actually lock the strategy even further. So we could edit this part, and we could then say, well, let's imagine that they are only calling with, in fact, I'm just going to erase all of this. Let's erase everything so that I can start again. Let's imagine that they're only calling with, if I empty all here, if I go flush draw, 100% they're flush draws, and maybe like middle pair or better. So like second pair, top pair, over pair, two pair, set. So let's say they are check calling with all of their middle strength hands. Oh, and maybe I guess, yeah, queens, jacks, and tens. So any pair of nines or better, any flush draw, they're check calling. But everything else, they're just check folding. Let's say that this is their strategy here. And they are, I should also have them never check raising. So we've got no check raises in there at all. And that looks about right. So yeah, okay. Oh wait, no, we've got to get rid of these turn off and these jack off. There we go. Okay. So they've got no check raising at all, and they're check folding. They're check folding a ton basically. In fact, I think maybe I have. Oh yeah, there we go. This queen off is out of there. Sixes is out of there. There we go. Okay, cool. So there's absolutely nothing in their check raising range. So now we're gonna run this calculation again, and it's going to be a pretty straightforward one because they're going to be checking 100%, and they're going to be folding. Well, we know what the check raising range is. We know what their calling range is, and now we're basically gonna solve this situation to find player 2's optimal strategy here between checking back and betting, and which hands they should be doing which thing with. So we're going to calculate, and we're going to see what comes up. It may take, hopefully not quite as long to calculate this time. It took about 7 to 8 minutes the previous time. It's a bit of a more straightforward calculation here, but we'll see what happens. So I'll be back with you in a moment to show you the result of this slightly more maximally exploitative calculation here. Okay, here we go. Here is our exploitative scenario. Obviously, we can see that player 1 checking 100% is leading player 2 to play a strategy that is more or less kind of obvious. They're actually betting 99.97% of their hands on the flop. And the only hand that they are occasionally checking are, I guess, pocket tens, like very, very rarely, like 1%, 0% of the time. Just occasionally a couple of other hands, like they really don't have to do much. It's like a fraction of a percent that they're checking everything. So it's essentially just a 100% betting range here. And if we go back to the original calculation, you can see that player 1 is now playing so far away from the GTO strategy that their EV has now gone down to 3.007, and player 2's EV has gone up to 4.493. So player 2 is now capturing more of the pot here than player 1 is, because their strategy is quite simply exploiting player 1's ridiculous approach of checking the flop every single time and only calling with a middle pair or better or a flush draw. So this is obviously a very extreme example, but you can see here how the dynamics of GTO solutions are affecting these calculations. You can see that there is a certain percentage beyond which player 1 and player 2 need to be calling or folding or raising, just based on the opponent's bet sizing. And most of the time that is to do with not allowing the opponent to automatically profit with any hand that they bet. So for example, if they bet half pot, if let's say player 1 bets half pot, if player 2 folds more than 33% of the time, player 1 automatically profits for the most part. There are some nuances that mean that's not always 100% true on the flop, but generally speaking, that rule is going to hold true. So each player has to play in a way that avoids folding too much, but also avoids giving away too much EV in this situation. So we can see that it plays out here with a diverse set of strategies, and you can see that the closer we get to a maximally exploitative strategy, the more we start doing the same thing 100% of the time with a lot of different hands. And the further we get away from maximally exploitative, the closer we get to GTO, the more we start mixing it up. And on some boards, you'll see players mixing it up more than others. On this board, you can see the original GTO strategy if we actually reload that here, it's called example 1 just here. So if we reload the original strategy here, we've actually got 60.48%, 39.51% as the betting ranges and checking ranges. So we can see how mixed up they are, and we can see that when player 1 does bet, player 2 is calling 49% of the time and raising 16%. So that 65, 66 percent folding frequency is roughly maintained there. So that half pot bet is pretty much breaking even. It's neither automatically profiting nor automatically losing. And those frequencies and those sort of steady, unexploitable frequencies are the kinds of things that GTO play is based on. So this was a very quick and very rough guide to understanding GTO solutions and how to use simple post-flop to come to a solution for a particular spot, how to go through a minimally exploitative calculation, and finally to do a maximally exploitative one where you know a big chunk of your opponent's strategy. Obviously, there's a lot more in-depth stuff that you can do with this program, but this is just a kind of a guideline video that gives you an introduction to how to use this program, and hopefully I'll get the chance to show you guys a lot more calculations in future, and we'll be able to look at some real game hands where it's not just a case of throwing in random ranges and seeing what happens. But you can tell here how useful this program is, and hopefully I'll get to use it with you guys in future. So thanks very much, and I'll talk to you soon. This is Matt Hunt for Two Cards College.